All right, guys. So the third lecture of the morning in this room will be held by Dinesh Kumar, and it is entitled "Understanding Poetry Through Literary Devices." And Dinesh Kumar has been working as an assistant professor of English at Dyal Singh College in India for the last 15 years as a permanent faculty member of the department. His thrust areas of research comprise feminism, Dalit literature, comparative literature, Commonwealth literature, and postmodernism. So he's also edited like 2 books of foreign professors. And like he's done like many things. Like I don't think I can read his full curriculum, but just to give you a gist of who our lecturer is, he also has delivered more than 20 extension lectures on different genres, including poetry, plays, fiction, communication skills, in various colleges and national as well as international webinars. And he has also chaired 10 technical sessions in various conferences. That's such a track record. Welcome to our event, and the floor is yours.
So should I start now, sir?
Yes, the floor is yours.
Okay, sir. Thank you very much, sir, for giving me this opportunity. So first, we start with how poetry, it is the part of literature. And literature, we know that it is the mirror of life. It reflects life in its varied manifestations, social, political, and religious. Literature is a term in which we can include different genres: poetry, fiction, drama, short stories, essays, and memoirs. Of all these genres, poetry is the most effective and subtle form of expressing one's ideas, emotions, and feelings in direct or indirect way. Poetry explores one's ideas, feelings, and emotions in an indirect manner, in the sense that a poet uses a number of poetic devices, including rhyme, meter, sound, language. Language can be simple as well as condensed, which leads to the final production of a poem. And it is also an established fact that of all the literary genre, poetry is generally considered as the highest form of literature. It influences an individual's life the most as it manifests diverse hues and colors of human life. In fact, critics regard poetry as the most ancient art, which is the product of human's imagination. In comparison to fiction, prose, and drama, poetry is the means through which the feeling of love, sorrow, and anger can be expressed in a better way. Poetry is in fact a constant being produced by all known civilizations from ancient to modern time. Throughout its extensive history, the individual art of high emotions sublimated into perfect language of poetry. It has approached a vast array of subject matters, including love, social issues, war, and beauty of nature. That is why W.H. Auden rightly and aptly remarks that poetry is clear expression of mixed feelings, as particular exercise of mind and soul, and a unique way of apprehending reality. Poetry is generally regarded as self-sufficient universe that intensifies and enlarges life experiences, pointing to inner knowledge rather than real circumstances. Poetry activates different layers of perception. By sweeping away human thoughts, poetry feeds emotion and soothes sufferings. The main function of poetry is to give pleasure, or what we should call it aesthetic pleasure. But at the same time, poetry is also the art of uniting pleasure with truth, as says Dr. Samuel Johnson. No doubt, poetry also instructs, as William Wordsworth has rightly remarked, that poetry can teach us in a better way in comparison to a teacher and a preacher. Robert Frost is also right in saying that a poem begins in delight but ends on wisdom. In that way, we can say that poetry serves the purpose of art for life's sake. So a real poet will treat art of poetry writing as wine where only the pleasure values matter. Taking into consideration.
Sorry, just one moment. Could you speak closer to the microphone, because the interpreter cannot hear you very well? Okay.
Just a minute, sir.
If you could speak a little closer. Do you have a PowerPoint presentation you would like to share or no?
No, sir, I don't have PowerPoint presentation. Now I think I'm a bit clearly audible.
Yes. Let me ask, what's your name again? Fernanda? Is it better now?
Am I audible now?
Just one moment. Fernanda, can you hear him like better now? If you could write, because I cannot hear you. So, but yeah, it's a little better. So it got better.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Got a little better.
So poetry is the form of literature based on the interplay of words and rhyme. It often employs rhyme and meter, a set of rules governing the number and arrangement of syllable in each line. In poetry, words are strung together to form sound, images, and ideas that might be too complex or abstract to describe directly. Poetry was once written according to fairly strict rules of meter and rhyme, and each culture had its own rules. For example, Anglo-Saxon poets had their own rhyme schemes and meters, while Greek poets and Arabic poets had others. Although these classical forms are still widely used today, modern poets frequently do away with rules together. Their poems generally do not rhyme and do not fit any particular meter. These poems, however, still have a rhythmic quality and seek to create beauty through their words. Now, I come to the topic that how we can understand poetry in a better way through the literary devices. And before that, we should know what defines poetry. So perhaps the characteristic feature that is central to the definition of poetry is its unwillingness to be defined, labeled, or nailed down. Poetry is the chiseled marble of language. It is a paint spattered canvas, but the poet uses words instead of paint, and the canvas is you. Poetic definitions of poetry kind of spiral in on themselves, however, like a dog eating itself from the tail up. So one of the most you can say accurate, or you can say the most you can say important characteristics of the poetic form is the economy of language. Poets are you can say miserly and unrelentingly critical in the way they dole out the words, carefully selecting word from conciseness and clarity is its standard even for writers of prose. However, poets go well beyond this, considering a word emotive quality, its backstory, its musical value, its double or triple can say meanings that we generally can say include in the ambiguity of the language, and even its spatial relationship on the page. The poet, through innovation of both word choice and form, seemingly rends significance from you can say thin air. So we come to the you can say the topic that because we have only 45 minutes you have given me. So first of all, I would like to discuss can say type of poetry or the dramatic poems we have, where we have the you can say the subject noun that is here, but I cannot show it without you can say PPT. So I will discuss you can say only those things. So haiku, that is they can say the popular form of the poetry, which has its genesis in Japan country. A haiku is a poem of poetry having three unrhymed verse for which are you can say unrhymed nature poem of 17 syllables, and these three lines are generally known as terect. It has been divided in such a manner that the first and the third line have 5 syllables each, and the middle line has 7 syllables. Each of the you can say chief features of haiku poem is that a season or something that indicate a specific region must be you can say mentioned in this poem. Then we have another type of poem, tenka. This is you can say the similar to you can say haiku poem, but in a tenka poem we come across more syllable coupled with you can say the use of simile, metaphors, and personification. In this type of poem, there are 5 lines containing 31 syllables, and the division of the syllable in each line can be according to the pattern 5, 7, 5, 7, and 7. Then we have concrete poem. A concrete poem is one in which the words are arranged in such a manner that it creates a picture that relates to the content of the poem. Then we have limerick. Limerick is the main aim of this type of poem is to provide humor, which is a poem of 5 lines, and we have can say the first, second, and the fifth line either anapestic, can say the third and the fourth line of are anapestic diameter. So it is usually a narrative poem based on the short and often can say there is, you can say, a particular rhyme scheme. Then we have a poem free verse. Most of the modern poets, they are using free verse without any rhyme scheme they are writing. So there is no longer, you can say, any rule that is followed by the poets. So especially throughout the entire poem, we find free verse. Frankly, it has no rule about meter or rhyme whosoever. So the modern poetry is based on, you can say, it is, you can say, most of the modern poetry, it has been written in free verse. And a poem written in free verse does not follow any rule. So we have also blank verse, any poetry that does not have a set metrical pattern, generally you can say iambic pentameter, but does not have, you can say, rhyme. So it is blank verse. Shakespeare frequently used unrhymed iambic pentameter in his plays. His works are the early examples of blank verse. In the same way, Christopher Marlowe, during the Elizabethan period, he also wrote, you can say, his poetry was dramas in this type of, you can say, verse, blank verse. We have descriptive poem. It is a poem that describes the world that surrounds the speaker. It uses elaborate imagery and adjectives. While emotional, it is more outward focused than lyric poetry, which is more personal and introspective. So in comparison to a lyric poem, which is, you can say, based on some personal experiences or introspection, we don't have, you can say, we find these elements almost missing in this poem. We have also reflective poetry. Reflectivity, it is the ability to perceive our responses to the world around us, other people and event, and use, you can say, that to inform our action, communication, and understanding. Reflection, evidence, and clarity are the features of reflective poetry. A reflective poem is generally quite long, and it is also a very thoughtful poem. It is a type of genre of poetry in which the poet expresses his state of mind by assimilating images and symbols. We have narrative poem. Epic poems are, you can say, generally narrative poems, long narrative poems we have, like Iliad and Homer, and Chaucer wrote in 14th century the Canterbury Tale. And we have also, can say, in narrative poems, we have 3 types of poem. First is epic, long, we can say, narrative poem, which are based on some serious subject matters. And the example of Homer Iliad, can be quoted in this direction. Then we have ballads. Ballads derive from the French chansons ballade, so which are poems set to music and intended for dancing. Because of its strong musical background, ballads are associated with a specific meter. So ballads are typically written with the alternating lines of iambic tetrameter. Then the third type of, you can say, narrative poem is Otherian romances. Otherian romances derive from the 12th century France, and there are many narrative poetry that tells stories of romance and adventure within the, you can say, this framework. And we have, you can say, poem ode. Ode is a poem which is addressed to someone, some person or somebody or something. So Thomas Gray in the 18th century, he dealt with the, you can say, ode poetry, and later on during the Romantic period, John Keats, he is, you can say, known as one of the greatest poet of ode poetry. And ode poetry is, you can say, of, you can say, 4 types, 3 types, sorry. Pindar ode, Pindar. Pindar was the first who started writing the ode poetry. He, you can say, started writing choral poems which were meant to be sung at public events, and it contains 3 triads: strophe, antistrophe, and final stanza. These are some, you can say, devices. Horatian ode. The name of this ode was taken from the Latin poet Horace. Unlike heroic odes of the Pindar, Horatian ode is informal. Then we have irregular odes. This type of ode is without any formal rhyme scheme and the structure such as the Pindaric odes. So the poet has great freedom and flexibility to try any type of concept and moods in this irregular ode. So we now come to some literary devices and some poetic forms of in poetry. The first is conceit, as it was, you can say, popular during the Elizabethan period, and later on you can say the metaphysical poets like John Donne, Herbert Crashaw, and Henry Vaughan. They wrote their poetry on the basis of some conceit. Conceit means originally a concept or image. Image in the, you can say, image in the mind of the readers. When we are reading a word, when we are going through the words of the poetry, then we a picture is created in our mind. And it came from the term figure of speech that establishes a striking parallel, usually you can say between two very dissimilar thing or situation. English poet of 16th century and 17th century, they adopted the term from the Italian concetto. Conceit has been derived from the word concetto, and there are two types of conceit which are often distinguished by specific names. First is Petrarchan conceit. It is the type of, we can say, device that was used in love poems. It had been novel and effective in Italian poetry. It was a new, we can say, device, and it was used by Petrarch, the Italian poet, but became, you can say, very popular among the Elizabethan sonneteers like Shakespeare and others. So this figure of speech consists of detailed and ingenious and even exaggerated comparison applied to the disdainful mistress, as cold and cruel as she is beautiful, and to the distress to and despair of her, can say, worshipful lover. Shakespeare, who generally employs this type of conceit time and again, so we find, you can say, um, in his, you can say, sonnet, two lines I am quoting. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. So we have the second type of conceit used by the poet later on after Shakespeare. We have the metaphysical poets like John Donne and Richard Crashaw, Henry Vaughan. They dealt with the metaphysical conceit. A metaphysical conceit is a characteristic figure in the work of John Donne and other metaphysical poets in the 16th century. This term was described by Dr. Samuel Johnson, and he described this term as wit. And the metaphysical poet exploited all knowledge, commonplace, practical, theological, or philosophical, true or fabulous, for the vehicle of, you can say, these type of figures. Their comparisons were often novel and witty, and at their best effective in sharp contrast to both concept and figures of conventional Petrarchan in John Donne's poem The Flea. The metaphysical conceit fell out of favor in the 18th century, but in the early decade of the 20th century, and there are, you can say, number of modern poets who exploited this type of figure of speech. Then we have another figure of speech which we generally, you can say, come across, that is paradox. A paradox is a statement which seems to be, you can say, uh, that to be logically contradictory or absurd, yet it turns out to be inseparable in a way that makes sense. An instance of this type of, can say, figure of speech, we can find in John Donne's sonnet, Death Be Not Proud, where the poet concludes, one short sleep past, we wake eternally, and thou shalt be no more. Death, thou shalt die. So the paradox is used occasionally by almost all the poets, but it was a persistent and central device in 17th century metaphysical poetry, both in its religious and secular forms. Donne exploited this technique constantly in his poetry, and his poem, you can say, the canonization, it is also the best example of this figure of speech, paradox. And paradox is also a frequent component in verbal wit. Paradox was a prominent concern of many new critics. They extended the term from its limited application to a type of figurative language so as to encompass all surprising deviation from or qualification of common perception of commonplace opinions. So we come to know Clintbrook, who is a 20th century critic, who says that the language of poetry is the language of paradox, he says. Now we have, you can say, sonnet. Sonnet is a, you can say, lyric poem which has, you can say, single stanza. The main feature of a sonnet is that it centers around a single idea. We have two types of sonnet, English sonnet or Shakespearean sonnet, and then we have Italian sonnet or Petrarchan sonnet. So the English sonnet, as Shakespeare, he was you can say using this type of sonnet very much during the Elizabethan period. So it is also known as, because he was also a dominating figure during the Elizabethan period, that's why the sonnet has been given the name the Shakespearean sonnet. And then we have, you can say, another figure of speech that we find, that is rhyme. Rhyme, it refers to, you can say, in English versification, standard rhymes consist of a repetition. In the rhyming words of the last stressed vowel and of all the speech sound for following the vowel, late, fate, follow, hollow, these are, you can say, the rhyming, you can say, words. And rhymes, for this, the most frequent type of rhyme at the end of the verse line, internal rhymes occur within a verse line, as in the Victorian poet Swinburne. Swinburne uses, you can say, this type of rhyme, the internal rhyme. And also you can say St. Coleridge, he has illustrated this type of rhyme in the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, and where he says in, you can say, the line, this, you can say, this internal rhyme can be, you can say, in line number 1, 3, and then we have in line number 2 and 4 alternate in an alternate manner. So Wordsworth also uses, you can say, this, you can say, in the Solitary Reaper, which is followed by a column which mark the terminal rhyme element by the corresponding sequence and repetition of the letters of alphabet. He wrote the poem The Solitary Reaper, where he uses, you can say, the column at the end of the line, which is the example of what we call terminal rhyme. So we have alliteration, which is also, you can say, the important figure of speech that we've come across in poetry. Alliteration is the repetition of speech sound in a sequence of nearby words. The term is usually applied only to consonant, and only when the recurrent sound is made emphatic begins a word or a stress level within a word. In Old English, alternative, you can say, meter, alliteration is the principal organizing device of the verse line. The verse is unrhymed, and each line is divided into two half lines of two strong stresses by a decisive pause or caesura that we call, and at at least one, and usually both of the, you can say, two stressed syllable in the first half line alliterate with the first stressed syllable of the second half line. So you can say the example of this type of you can say rhyme we can find in William Legland's poem Pierre Plowman and Romance Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Both are written in, you can say, 14th century. Continue to use and play variation upon the old alternative in the opening line of Pierre Plowman. For example, there are four of the stress syllable alternate, where the poet says that in a summer season when soft was the sun. So in the later English versification, however, alliteration is used only for special stylistic effects, such as to reinforce the meaning, to link related words, or to provide you tone, color, and enhance the ability of enunciating the words. An example of the repetition of the S or TH or W consonant in Shakespeare sonnet number 30, we find. I quote the example, when to the season of sweet silent thought, we have W, then season S, then again sweet, silent. So S is, you can say, repeated again and again. I summon up remembrance of things past. I sigh. You can find that in every line, you can say this S sound is very much, you can say, repeated. And in the last line, I sigh the lack of many a thing I sought. So sigh and sought both are, you can say, S sound. So in you can say alliteration, we have two types of alliteration. One is consonance. Consonance is the repetition of a sequence of two or more consonant, but with a change in the intervening vowel. Live or love, lean or alone, Peter, Parter, W.H. Auden poems of the 1930. Oh, where are you going? This is the poem. He said to the readers, you can say that in this poem he makes, you can say, the sound of R, you can say prominent, you can say in the last stanza. If we go through, you can say that poem. Then we have, you can say, we can note the long I sound in the opening line of John Keats' poem, Ode on a Grecian Urn. Thou still unravished bride of quietness. Thou still I sound is there. Unravished I sound. Bride I sound. Quietness again I sound. Thou foster child of silence and slow time. So again you can say we find that here also we have you can say this uh, I sound, that is, you can say, most prominent. So we have now irony. Irony is generally defined as the difference between appearance and reality. It is the way of speaking that shows you are joking, or that you mean the opposite of what you say. So the difference between the appearance and reality, that is known as irony. It can be categorized into four types of, you can say, we have the first, situational irony. Situational irony occurs when the outcome of a situation differs greatly from what one would expect to happen. Situational irony can occur in everyday life. For example, seeing someone complain about you, and maybe you can say in literature, situational irony can build tension or lead to a great plot twist. It is a way to keep reader guessing what comes next, a kind of curiosity, and that we find in our, you can say, daily life also. When someone is talking to us, what happens when the murder gets murdered halfway through the story? So such type of, you can say, example can be quoted in situational irony. Situational irony, it is of, you can say, four types. First is cosmic irony. It occurs when a higher power, like a god, magic, or fate, intervenes and creates ironic situation. A character might appeal to God, who ends up making the situation more challenging. Then we have poetic irony. Poetic irony, it is also known as poetic justice, as this was the term, you can say, that we generally come across in the plays of William Shakespeare, in his tragedies particularly. So poetic justice is very, you can say, fitting outcome usually for a bad character. This is the trope of the punishment. And in, you can say, common words, we can define poetic justice when evil is punished and the good is rewarded. So we have structural irony. It is when a character is unaware of the situation they are in. So if we are, you can say, facing, you can say, any situation, but we are unaware of that, you can say, situation. In that case, the structural irony occurs. This might be the, you can say, fish out of the water trope, or the character ignorance. Maybe they don't know they are the chosen one, or you can say that their action have far-reaching effects. So we have also historical irony. It occurs when the consequences of a character's intended outcome cause the opposite of what they try to do. Suppose we want to achieve something, but we think that we can achieve that, but you can say the consequences are that we are not able to, we can say, achieve that. So it, you can say, refers to the historical irony. It can also mean a character's moral change over time in a way that affects their original goals, that we are deflected. The second is verbal irony. Verbal irony, it occurs as a, you can say, figure of speech when someone says one thing but means another. So in verbal, in our speaking terms, when we are, you can say, talking about, you can say, someone, but it means other. So it is known as verbal irony. As a literary device, this happens anytime the literal meaning of a statement differs from the author's or the character's intended meaning. Suppose my intended meaning is different, but the readers, they are, you can say, getting another idea from that, you can say, from my talk. So it is known as verbal irony. It can be a way to include humor or levity in a story also, but it is not always funny. It can also be used, you can say, to foreshadow events, what is likely to happen, or to create tension between the character. There are three major level, you can say, types of verbal irony. First is sarcasm, understatement, and then we have overstatement. Sarcasm occurs when someone says that the opposite of what is actually true, with the intent of being snide, or you can say even hurtful. Telling your sister she is your favorite sibling right after she ruined your favorite dress, it is an example of sarcasm. So we have understatement. Understatement are another type of verbal irony, and we have, you can say, a literary device used in poetry that is known as litotus, which are a specific type of understatement meant to express an affirmative by using a negative statement. For example, saying she's not the, you can say, nicest person to describe a character who is very mean is a litotus. So we have also overstatement. Generally it is known as hyperbole when we are exaggerating the things. So uh, overstatement are also, you can say, ironic. Hyperbole occurs when there is a great, you can say, over exaggeration, such as I am so hungry I could eat an entire hippo. So this is, you can say, an example of exaggeration. We have then dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is the third major type of irony in English literature that we come across, and it occurs when the audience or the readers, they know what is happening, but the character, they do not know what is happening. And it we have, you can say, many plays by William Congreve, The Way of the World, in which we find, you can say, this dramatic irony. And of all the type of irony, dramatic irony is the best at building tension. It creates tension at its best. And so the audience waits for the proverbial shoe to drop, and they watch character making bad choice and want to tell them to stop. But we cannot, you can say, we cannot stop the character in a play or in a novel. But we know that they are, you can say, making, you can say, they are not making a good choice. So dramatic irony also allows reader to pick up on more example of verbal irony as foreshadowing. It also illuminates difficult choice that character must make, and also intensifies the emotional aspect of a story. So we have sarcastic irony. Sarcastic irony is the, you can say, last type of, you can say, irony that we come across. So it is the method involves pretending that you don't know the answer and asking targeted questions. Another figure of speech that we come across in literature or in poetry particularly, that enriches the texture of a poem, it is onomatopoeia. Onomatopoeia is sometimes called as egoism, which is used both in narrow as well as in broad sense. In a narrow and most common sense, onomatopoeia, it designates a word or a combination of words whose sound seem to resemble closely the sound it denotes. Hiss sound, buzzing sound, rattle, bang, and there is exact, you can say, duplication, however, of non-verbal by verbal sounds. The perceived similarity, it is due as much to the meaning and to the feel of articulating the words. And two lines of Alfred Tennyson's poem, Come Down, O Maid. This poem is written by Tennyson, and you can say it is, you can say, that these two lines that I'm going to quote are an excellent example of, you can say, onomatopoeia. The moan of doves in immemorial elms, the murmuring of innumerable bees. One of the most renowned American critics, John Crow Ransom, has remarked that by making only two changes in the consonant of the last line, we lose the echoic because we change the meaning drastically. And murdering of innumerable bees. So this changes the, you can say, meaning where we are, you can say, uh, you can say changes the consonant in the last line. So the sound seemingly mimicked by onomatopoeia word need to be pleasant one. Robert Browning liked, you can say, this type of effects in his poems, and in one of his poem, Meeting at Night, he has used, you can say, this device in a very effective manner. In the broad sense, this was, you can say, the common use of onomatopoeia, but in a broad sense, onomatopoeia is applied to the words or the passages which seem to correspond or can say to strongly suggest what they denote in any way, whatever in size, movement, tactile, feel, duration of force, as well as you can say sound. Alexander Pope recommends such extended verbal mimicry in his poem Essay on Criticism when he says that, I quote, the sound should seem an echo of the sense, and goes on illustrating his maxim by mimicking two different kind of action for motion by the metrical movement and by the difficulty or case of utterance, the conjunction with the meaning of the poetic line that describe them, as he says in the poem. So this is a long quotation. I will not, you can say, go through it. So we have the understatement, as we have can say already gone through. Understatement is the contrary figure which deliberately represents something as very much less in magnitude or importance than it really is, or is ordinarily considered to be. The effect is, you can say, usually you can say ironic. We have already discussed understatement in, you can say, irony. So it is in Jonathan Swift's, you can say, book A Tale of a Tub, in which the narrator asserts the superiority of that wisdom which converges about the surface to that pretend philosophy which enter into the depth of things. It gives an example that we have also, you can say, one more example. I quote, last week I saw a woman played, and you will hardly believe how much it altered her person for the worse. So the understatement is comically ironic in, as we find in Mark Twain's statement. Mark Twain is an American, we can say, writer, and he states about understatement. The report of my death are greatly exaggerated. Some critics extend, you can say, memesis to the use of the literature of simple or unemphatic statement to enhance the effect of a deeply pathetic or tragic event. An example of this line at the close of the narrative in Wordsworth's poem Michael, he says, I quote, and never lifted up a single stone. So a special form of understatement is leaving litotus. So which means Greek for plain or simple. So the assertion of an affirmative by negative, it's contrary. He is not the greatest man in the world, meaning he is stupid. The figure is frequent in Anglo-Saxon poetry where the effect is usually one of grim irony. We have simile as one of the you can say figure of speech used by, you can say, poets, and the word simile has been derived from the Latin word similes, which means you can say like. In simile, we have, you can say, a direct comparison, and in simile we use two words like and as. Assembly is the explicit statement of the similarity between two different things. Simile is the rhetorical term used to designate the most elementary form of resemblance. And we find, you can say, two words like and as for the direct comparison of two things. And similarly, we have also, in contrary to simile, we have metaphor, which in which we don't use these two words like and as, but we use we draw only indirect comparison, and that is the basic difference between these two figure of speech. And we have symbol. The symbol is like a simile or metaphor with the first term left out. And the example in this, you can say, as example of symbol is, my love is like a red rose. It is a simile. If through persistent identification of this red rose with the beloved woman, we may come to associate the rose with her and her particular virtues. At this point, the rose would become a symbol, not a simile. So we have the parallel structure, a form of repetition where the order of the verb and the noun it is repeated. It may involve exact words, but it more you can say frequently repeats sentence structure. You can say the I quote the example: I came, I saw, I conquered. So this is the example of parallel structure. We have allegory. Allegory, it is a narrative, whether in prose or verse, and in which the agents and the action and sometimes the setting as well as are contrived by the author to make coherent sense on the literal primary level of signification. And we can distinguish two type of, we can say, allegory: historical and political allegory, in which the character and action that are signified literally in their turn represent or allegorize historical personages and events. We have the best example of, we can say, John Dryden's poem Absalom and Achitophel. King David represents Charles II. Absalom represents his natural son, the Duke of Monmouth. The biblical story of Absalom's rebellion against his father, it allegorizes the rebellion of Monmouth against King Charles II. So this is, you can say, what we find in case of, you can say, historical and political allegory. The allegory of ideas, in which the literal characters represent concept and the plot allegorizes an abstract doctrine of thesis. Both type of allegory may either be sustained throughout a work, as we find in Absalom and Achitophel, or also you can say in John Bunyan's book, The Pilgrim Progress, or as you can say serve as an episode in non-allegorical works. And in the second type of sustained allegory of ideas, the central device is mind, modes of life, and the type of character. And the best example is John Bunyan's The Pilgrim Progress, which allegorizes the Christian doctrine of salvation by telling how the character named Christian, warned by evangelist, flees the city of destruction and makes his way to the celestial city. And the best known example of allegory in English prose literature is Bunyan's The Pilgrim Progress, where the life of a Christian is represented through, you can say, this perilous journey with a happy termination after, among other long allegories may be mentioned, like Tennyson's poem Idylls of the King, Swift wrote Gulliver Travels, and Spencer wrote Fairy Queen. Fable. Fable is also, you can say, another, you can say, literary device that is used by. Fable is also called an apologue, or it is a short narrative in prose and verse that exemplifies an abstract moral thesis or principle of human behavior. So we have the in Chaucer's, you can say, book Canterbury Tale, we have Nun Priest Tale, the story of the cock and the fox. It is the best fable, and the American Joe Chandler Harris wrote many, you can say, stories that are the best fables ever. Sorry, beast fable ever told in the southern African American dialect, whose origin have been traced to folklore, folk tales in the oral literature of West Africa that feature a trickster like Uncle Remus Brer Rabbit. So we have, you can say, and we have also another, you can say, important figure of speech, that is metonymy. Metonymy has been derived from the Greek, you can say, word. It is a literal term for one thing applied to another, which with which it has become closely associated because of recurrent relationship in common experiences. The crown, the scepter can be used to stand for a king, and you can say Hollywood for the film industry. Milton can signify the writing of, we can say, Milton, and typical attire can signify male and female sexes. So we have, you can say, in Shakespeare's, you can say, play As You Like It, we have also the use of, you can say, metonymy. So, sir, I think this is, you can say, 45 minutes over.
I'm sorry?
Sir, I think 45 minutes have been completed of my lecture.
Yes, absolutely. Do you need to add something extra to your presentation?
And sir, and I have also you can say something to discuss, but because of you can say lack of time, I will not be able to discuss all this thing. But
Yes.
thank you, sir, for giving me this opportunity, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, we just reached the time for questions and answers. Okay, so we have a question from Olga here. Are you there, or are you still there? I don't know if she left. Olga is one of our, I think she left, but she left a question here in the chat so that she'll be able to watch the recording later. Thank you so much for the presentation. We had a bit of difficulty because of technology here in the room, so we couldn't hear you that very well. But we have at least one question here, and would really appreciate like a as much of a short answer as you could give due to like time. Okay, so Olga asks you, can you give an example of a haiku from the English literature from the 19th century? Since you're speaking of like figures of speech and the use of figure of speech in literature, right? So she asked if you have an example of a haiku from, like Japanese, I don't know, from the English literature from the 19th century.
In the 19th century, sir.
Yeah.
In the 9th, actually, sir, in our you can say literature here in India, we don't have any you can say Japanese poet prescribed, and through which we can come across the knowledge of you can say haiku poems. But generally, you can say a poem. This haiku poem, it is all about a season. Like autumn season or spring season or nature. You can say objects are you can say defined in haiku poem. And if the writer is you can say talking about you can say these, but the structure of a haiku poem it is you can say entirely different from you can say rest of the poems. John Keats in the 18th century he also you can say talks about you can say nature, and you can say we have also Tennyson. He's writing about you can say natural objects in his poetry, but we don't find that you can say structure that is available in a haiku poem in the you can say 19th century or you can say in 20th century, because it has you can say only 3 lines in a haiku poem, and most of the poet they are you can say writing in more than 3 lines in their poetry. So I don't find you can say, and I have also not gone through any Japanese you can say poet who are or old you can say those who were busy with writing you can say during the earlier poetry. So I don't you can say, but we have you can say some glimpses of nature, season in you can say the poetry of 19th century or 18th century poets.
Right. Has anyone got a question to ask him? No?
Yeah, no questions.
No? No questions. All right. I think I have a question myself, since you're speaking of like figures of speech and poetry, right? I think those represent like a great challenge for translation for the translator and for the interpreter, since, well, we had interpreters here in the booths. So which figure of speech that you mentioned throughout your presentation you think presents like the biggest challenges for translation? Do you think onomatopoeia? I find onomatopoeia quite interesting because I'm a learner.
Yes, sir. Because yeah. Generally, you can say poet they are using onomatopoeia these days. When in one line they are not able to express their thought fully, then this thought is you can say carried forward by the poet in the next line. So you can say by means of this you can say they are using this figure of speech, because in one line when they are not able to, because poetry it does not have, in the modern poetry particularly, it does not follow you can say any fixed rule, and that's why this you can say onomatopoeia it is you can say more present in you can say present day poetry or in the 19th century poetry, because spilling over the idea or the emotion in the next line, and that is you can say what we feature in onomatopoeia. And in generally you can say if you go through you can say irony, this is you can say because it is of different types, and there are also you can say subtypes of you can say irony that we perceive. So when we are you can say going through dramas or you can say novels also, not only in poetry, but also in prose also, novel or drama. In the, you can say in these genres also we find, you can say, the presence of irony, sarcasm, or these you can say that, but you can say the figure of speech like hyperbole or exaggeration, these are, you can say, only present in case of poetry. But irony, as we find that it is of different types. So I think it is the, you can say, biggest, you said biggest challenge, because it is also used in poetry. We have talked about, you can say, most of, you can say, poems in our lecture, but we have also, you can say, this figure of speech in drama as well as novels, in prose also.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. And I guess we'll be back. We're gonna have like a around like 2 hour break for lunch. And up next at 2:30 in the afternoon, we're gonna have 2 lectures. I'm gonna go to the other room, and we're gonna have Eliana Gonçalves, who's an Italian teacher, talk about didactic resources for online teaching. She's a material creator. And back in this room, we're going to have Juliano moderating the room for Kaline Porpino, who is going to talk about a decolonial perspective for teaching the French language. So thank you so much for your audience. And I guess we'll see each other at 2:30. Bye-bye, Dinesh. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.